Imagine waking up in the dead of winter, your breath forming clouds in the air before your eyes, stone walls surrounding you that seem to radiate cold rather than warmth. Now imagine this isn't some camping mishap or power outage. This was your everyday reality. For medieval nobles and servants alike, surviving the bone-chilling nights in massive stone fortresses wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a daily battle against death itself. The magnificent castles that dot Europe's landscape, those same structures we tour in comfortable shoes with audio guides, were once frigid death traps that required ingenious solutions just to make it through the night. How did they manage without central heating, thermal insulation, or even basic weather stripping? The answers will shock you and might make you grateful for that thermostat on your wall. Welcome to the forgotten struggle of medieval sleep, where the simplest act of surviving until morning required strategy, innovation, and sometimes sheer stubborn will. This isn't just history, it's a testament to human resilience in the face of environmental extremes that would send most of us modern humans running for the nearest heated hotel. Stone castles, the ultimate status symbol of medieval power, were essentially giant refrigerators. Their thick walls, designed to withstand sieges and attacks, absorbed cold during winter and held it like natural freezers. The grandeur that protected nobles from enemies simultaneously threatened to kill them with cold. Ironic, isn't it? The very structures built to keep people safe became one of their greatest challenges for survival. Did you know that in some medieval castles, wine would freeze solid in its goblets during dinner? Or that servants would sometimes find birds that had literally frozen to death mid-flight after entering through open windows? These aren't exaggerations. They're documented realities of castle life that rarely make it into our romanticised versions of medieval times. The medieval period spanned roughly 1,000 years, from the 5th to the 15th century, encompassing what many call the Dark Ages, and extending through the High Middle Ages into the early Renaissance. During this vast time span, Europe experienced what climatologists now refer to as the medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age, a cooling period that began in approximately the 14th century. This climate shift made the already difficult task of staying warm in castles even more challenging as the medieval period progressed. But before we dive deeper into how people survived, let's address a fundamental question. Why build with stone at all if it was so problematic? The answer lies in a complex web of practical necessity, status signalling, and the limitations of medieval technology. Stone castles weren't just homes, they were military installations, governmental centres, and physical manifestations of power. Wood structures, while warmer, were vulnerable to fire, a constant threat in medieval times, and easier for enemies to breach or burn during sieges. The wealthy and powerful chose security and permanence over comfort, a decision that would shape their daily lives in ways we can hardly imagine today. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be a medieval lord or lady, lying awake as howling winds found every crack in your stone bedroom? Or perhaps a servant, huddled in a corner of the great hall, fighting for space near dying embers? The reality was far from the cosy fairy tale scenes we might envision. The first and most obvious solution to castle coldness was fire. Lots of it. But medieval heating was nothing like flipping on a modern furnace. Great halls would feature massive central hearths, often built into the floor itself in earlier castles, where fires blazed day and night during winter months. Later designs incorporated huge fireplaces built into walls, some large enough for a person to stand inside. Yet despite their impressive size, these heat sources were shockingly inefficient. Would you believe that most of the heat from medieval fireplaces went straight up the chimney rather than into the room? The physics of heat distribution meant that, unless you were practically sitting in the flames, much of the warmth escaped. This created bizarre temperature gradients, where one side of your body might be uncomfortably hot, while the other remained freezing. Contemporary accounts describe people constantly rotating like rotisserie chickens in front of fires, trying to heat themselves evenly. In Windsor Castle, one of England's most magnificent royal residences, the problem of heating was taken so seriously that during Edward III's renovations in the 14th century, he incorporated multiple fireplaces in the royal apartments, a luxury almost unheard of at the time. Yet even with this extravagance, his queen, Philippa of Hainaut, complained bitterly about the cold in her letters, describing how her ladies-in-waiting would sometimes weep from the pain in their fingers as they tried to dress her in the morning. But what about those who couldn't claim space near precious fireplaces? Here's where medieval ingenuity truly shines. Castle dwellers developed layered strategies for survival that went far beyond simply piling on blankets. The medieval bed was not just furniture, it was survival architecture. Four-poster beds with heavy curtains weren't designed for privacy or aesthetics alone. They created a micro-environment where body heat could be trapped and preserved. These bed curtains were often made of thick wool or velvet and would be completely closed once occupants were inside, creating a tent-like space where breath and body heat could raise the temperature significantly compared to the open room. Shocking as it may seem to our modern sensibilities, sharing beds was common practice across all social classes. Even kings and queens often shared their beds not just with spouses, but sometimes with trusted servants or nobles. Body heat was too precious a resource to waste on privacy concerns. Lower-ranking castle residents might sleep 10 or more to a bed, arranged head to toe to maximise space. Far from being considered strange, this practice was simply practical winter survival. Have you ever noticed how dogs and cats curl up to sleep? Medieval people understood this instinctive behaviour and emulated it. The fetal position, with knees drawn up to the chest, minimises surface area and conserves body heat. Historical accounts and illustrations show people sleeping in what looks like uncomfortably tight balls, rather than the sprawled positions many prefer today. But the ingenuity didn't stop with body positioning and bed curtains. What went into the bed itself was a masterclass in insulation technology using pre-industrial materials. Mattresses were typically stuffed with straw, which despite its humble nature, contains thousands of tiny air pockets that trap heat remarkably well. Wealthier individuals might have mattresses filled with wool or even feathers. Beneath these mattresses, rope supports would provide some elevation from the cold floor, critical when you consider that heat rises and cold air pools at floor level. Consider this. Archaeologists examining preserved medieval bedding have found evidence of multiple layers being used simultaneously. Furs closest to the body, then wool blankets, then heavier coverlets, and finally thick outer covers that might be filled with more feathers or wool. The weight alone of these coverings could be substantial, with some historical accounts suggesting that noble beds might be topped with coverings weighing 20 pounds or more. Did medieval people simply accept being cold as an inevitable part of life? Absolutely not. They fought against it, with every tool at their disposal, including some that might seem bizarre to modern sensibilities. Hot stones or bricks wrapped in cloth were placed in beds before sleeping to pre-warm the sheets. These medieval hot water bottles would be heated in the fire throughout the evening and then strategically placed where they would do the most good, typically at the foot of the bed where extremities could benefit most. Even more ingenious were bed-warming pans, long-handled metal containers that servants would fill with hot coals and slide between the sheets to warm them before nobles retired for the night. These devices, often made of brass or copper for better heat conduction, would be moved in a continuous pattern between the sheets, creating an even warmth that would linger for the crucial first hour of sleep, when the body is most vulnerable to cold. The wealthy had another secret weapon against the cold: human warmers. Yes, you read that correctly. Lower-ranking servants, often young boys called bed warmers, would be sent to lie in the beds of their masters before the nobles retired, using their body heat to take the deadly chill from the sheets. Once the bed was deemed sufficiently warmed, they would be dismissed so their superiors could take their place in the now tolerable bedding. Imagine that as part of your job description. What about those who couldn't afford such luxuries? For the majority of castle inhabitants, the servants, guards and lower-ranking staff, survival required community solutions. Most would sleep in the great hall or other communal spaces, as close to the main fire as their rank would allow. The hierarchy of warmth was strictly observed, with those of higher status claiming spots nearest heat sources, while those at the bottom of the social ladder might be relegated to corners where temperatures could dip below freezing. Would it surprise you to learn that castle architecture itself evolved partly in response to the challenge of staying warm? Early medieval castles featured great halls with central hearths, but as the period progressed, more sophisticated designs emerged. By the 13th and 14th centuries, castle builders were incorporating features specifically designed to mitigate the cold problem. Take Edinburgh Castle, perched high on an extinct volcano in Scotland, where winters could be brutally harsh. The royal apartments were constructed with relatively low ceilings compared to ceremonial spaces, reducing the volume that needed to be heated. Windows were strategically placed to maximise southern exposure for natural solar heating, while minimising openings on north-facing walls. Even the thickness of walls varied, with external north-facing walls built thicker than south-facing ones, providing better insulation against prevailing winter winds. But perhaps the most fascinating architectural adaptation was the development of the solar, a private chamber for the lord and lady that was typically located on an upper floor, often above the kitchen. This placement was no accident. Heat rises, and medieval builders learned to harness this principle by positioning living quarters where they could benefit from the constant cooking fires below. In essence, they created a primitive form of central heating, with the kitchen serving as the furnace for the entire castle. The evolution of the chimney revolutionised castle heating. Earlier medieval structures featured central hearths with smoke holes in the roof, inefficient systems that filled rooms with smoke and lost tremendous heat. The development of the wall fireplace with a proper chimney in the 12th century allowed for more controlled heating and significantly less smoke, though the heat efficiency remained poor by modern standards. By the late medieval period, some castles featured primitive forms of hypocaust heating, systems inspired by ancient Roman designs where hot air from fires would be channeled through spaces beneath floors or within walls. Have you considered how the daily rhythms of medieval life were shaped by the constant battle against cold? Unlike our 24/7 modern world, medieval castle life followed the sun with religious dedication. Rising at dawn and retiring not long after sunset wasn't just tradition. It was a practical response to heating challenges. Daylight hours were precious not only for visibility in a world without electric lighting, but because the sun provided free heating that no amount of firewood could match. The sheer logistics of keeping a castle warm enough to prevent death was staggering. A large medieval castle might consume several acres of forest each winter, just for heating and cooking. Wood cutting and transportation became crucial castle operations, with dedicated staff responsible for ensuring sufficient supply. Records from some royal castles show that wood procurement was a year-round activity, with summer and fall dedicated to cutting and drying wood that would be consumed during the winter months. Imagine the physical labour involved: trees felled with hand axes, cut into manageable pieces, transported by ox cart or human power, stacked to dry, and finally carried into the castle daily by servants whose sole job was keeping fires fed. This constant movement of fuel represented a significant portion of a castle's operating expenses and required careful management. Wood shortages could and did occur, sometimes with deadly consequences during particularly harsh winters. The coldest castles in Europe weren't necessarily in the northernmost regions as you might expect. Castles in coastal Scotland, while certainly cold, benefited from the moderating influence of ocean currents. Some of the truly frigid fortresses were found in Central and Eastern Europe, where continental climate patterns created temperature extremes. Castles in places like Bohemia, modern Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland faced winter temperatures that could plunge far below, freezing for months at a time. Consider Spiš Castle in present-day Slovakia, one of Europe's largest castle complexes. Built at an elevation of over 2,000 feet and exposed to harsh continental winters, surviving there required extreme measures. Archaeological evidence suggests that in the deepest winter, entire sections of the castle would be abandoned. With activities consolidated in a few somewhat warmer areas, the garrison would essentially hibernate in a small portion of the massive structure, minimising the space that needed to be heated for survival. What about castles in warmer Mediterranean regions? Did they escape these challenges? Not entirely. While southern European castles in places like Spain, southern France and Italy certainly faced less extreme cold, they weren't immune to winter's bite. Stone construction still created challenging interior environments during colder months. Moreover, many were built at high elevations for defensive purposes, where temperatures could drop significantly regardless of latitude. The famous Alhambra in Granada, Spain for instance, experiences winter snowfall despite being in southern Europe, and its Moorish designers incorporated sophisticated heating systems, including underfloor heating channels inspired by Roman hypocausts. The experience of castle cold varied dramatically by social class. For the lord and lady, the winter might bring discomfort, but rarely mortal danger. They had access to the best heating, the warmest clothing, and the most nutritious food to fuel their bodies' internal heating systems. But as you moved down the social hierarchy, the threat level increased exponentially. Did you know that hypothermia was a leading cause of death among castle servants during winter months? While rarely recorded as such, medieval death records typically being vague about causes. Modern analysis of historical accounts suggests that many winter fevers and unexplained deaths were likely cases of hypothermia, particularly among the elderly and very young who were most vulnerable to cold. For the lowest-ranking castle inhabitants, sleeping arrangements were primitive at best. Many slept on thin pallets on the floor of the great hall or kitchen, with only straw for insulation beneath them and whatever blankets they could claim. These communal sleeping areas created their own survival strategy. Dozens of bodies in close proximity generated significant heat. Contemporary accounts describe the great hall floor at night as a sea of sleeping humanity, with barely an inch of space between bodies. The medieval approach to cold was not merely reactive, but incorporated preventative strategies that began long before winter arrived. Fall was a time of intense preparation, not just for food storage, but for cold weather survival. Tapestries, which we now appreciate primarily for their artistic value, were essential functional items. During summer they might be stored away, but as temperatures dropped, every available wall in inhabited rooms would be covered with these heavy woven hangings. These weren't just decorative elements, they served as crucial insulation. A thick tapestry covering a stone wall could raise the ambient temperature of a room by several degrees by preventing the stone from radiating cold into the space. The most valuable tapestries were made of wool, which naturally insulates even when thin. The elaborate hunting scenes or biblical narratives woven into these functional art pieces gave castle dwellers something to contemplate during long winter evenings while simultaneously keeping them alive. Floor coverings played a similar role. Rush matting, floors covered with dried marsh reeds, provided crucial insulation from the cold stone beneath. These would be replaced several times during winter as they compressed and lost their insulating properties. In wealthier households, layers of rush matting might be topped with woolen carpets in the most important rooms, creating primitive but effective floor insulation. What about windows, those notorious sources of drafts? Glass was an expensive luxury throughout most of the medieval period, and even when used, medieval glass was thin and poorly insulating by modern standards. Many castle windows were simply openings that could be covered with wooden shutters, effective for blocking wind but doing little to prevent heat loss. More sophisticated window coverings included oiled parchment, which allowed some light while blocking wind, thin animal horn panels, which functioned similarly to primitive glass or fabric screens. During the coldest weather, windows might be completely sealed with a combination of fabric, straw stuffing, and even wax or clay to block every possible draft. The resulting interior was dark, but significantly warmer. Would it surprise you to learn that some castle dwellers intentionally reduced their living space during winter? archaeological evidence shows that in many castles, entire wings or floors might be abandoned during the coldest months, with life concentrated in a few somewhat warmer areas. This strategic retreat created smaller spaces that could be heated more effectively with available resources. The clothing worn by medieval castle dwellers represented another sophisticated layer of defence against the cold. Forget the lightweight flowing garments often depicted in Hollywood interpretations of the period. Winter clothing in medieval castles was serious business, designed with thermal efficiency as the primary concern. The foundation of medieval warmth was linen, not for its insulating properties, which are poor, but because it wickered moisture away from the body. Staying dry was understood to be crucial for staying warm, even if the scientific principle wasn't fully articulated. Over this base layer came wool, nature's technical fabric. Wool retains insulating properties even when damp, a critical feature in the often humid environment of stone castles where condensation was a constant issue. Multiple layers were the rule, not the exception. A noble might wear a linen undershirt, followed by a wool tunic, then a heavier over-tunic, and finally a fur-lined cloak or mantle indoors. Legs would be covered with wool hose or leggings, often reinforced with additional layers. Head covering was considered essential, as medieval people understood that significant body heat escapes through the head. Indoor caps or coifs were worn even by men, a practice that would seem strange by today's fashion standards. The wealthy supplemented wool with fur, the ultimate medieval luxury and the most effective natural insulation available. Fur-lined cloaks, gloves and boots were status symbols and survival gear simultaneously. The type of fur signalled one's exact place in the social hierarchy, with ermine and sable reserved for the highest nobility, while rabbit, fox and sheepskin served those of more modest means. Even medieval fashion trends were influenced by the practical needs of warmth. The long, trailing sleeves popular in the 14th and 15th centuries weren't just decorative, they served as built-in hand warmers. The practice of slashing, decorative cuts in the outer layer of clothing that allowed an inner layer to show through, created additional air pockets for insulation, while displaying one's wealth through multiple layers of expensive fabric. Have you ever wondered how medieval people kept their extremities, particularly vulnerable to frostbite, from freezing in unheated castle environments? Gloves and mittens were essential equipment, often worn indoors throughout the day. Surviving examples show sophisticated designs, including early versions of convertible mittens that could fold back to free the fingers for detailed work before being flipped back for warmth. Footwear presented special challenges. Cold stone floors could leach heat from the body with remarkable efficiency. The solution was platform shoes, not primarily as fashion statements, but as practical insulation from cold floors. Wooden-soled clogs or pattens would be worn over leather shoes, creating an air gap between foot and floor that significantly reduced heat loss. Inside private chambers, wealthy individuals might use foot boxes, wooden containers filled with heated bricks or stones and covered with fur, to keep feet warm while seated. The medieval understanding of human physiology in relation to cold was surprisingly sophisticated, despite lacking modern scientific framework. They recognised that certain parts of the body, particularly the chest, head and feet, needed extra protection. They understood that the very young and very old were most vulnerable to cold's effects. They even grasped that certain foods and drinks could increase one's ability to generate internal heat. Speaking of food, the medieval diet shifted dramatically, with the seasons specifically to combat cold. Summer meals might feature more fruits, vegetables and lighter fare, but winter dining focused on high-calorie, high-fat options that fueled the body's internal furnace. Pork, with its high-fat content, was a particularly valued winter food. Preserved meats, aged cheeses, and hearty grain porridges formed the backbone of the winter castle diet. Spices played a dual role in winter cuisine, adding flavour to preserved foods while also increasing circulation. Medieval medical theory held that hot spices like ginger, cinnamon, and pepper could warm the body from within. While modern science would explain this as increased blood flow from capsaicin and similar compounds rather than actual warming, the effect was real enough. Spiced wine, the famous Hippocras of medieval feasts, combined alcohol, which dilates blood vessels, with warming spices for a potent, if temporary, warming effect. Would you believe that beer consumption in medieval castles was partly a survival strategy? The caloric content of the typical small beer, a low-alcohol everyday beverage, provided significant energy for heat generation. A servant might consume 2 to 3 quarts daily in winter, providing as much as 1,000 calories that translated directly into body heat in an era where physical labour was constant and obesity rare. The sleeping arrangements of medieval castle dwellers reveal much about both social hierarchy and survival strategies. The lord and lady typically occupied the chamber of highest status, usually the solar, often positioned to benefit from rising heat from kitchens or great halls below. Their bed would be the finest in the castle, with multiple mattresses, feather pillows, and the best coverings including furs. Just below them in the hierarchy, honoured guests and higher-ranking household members might have private or semi-private chambers, though often significantly less comfortable than the lord's quarters. As you moved down the social ladder, privacy decreased while shared sleeping arrangements became the norm. Knights and men-at-arms might sleep in dedicated barracks within the castle, typically with multiple men to a bed. Ladies-in-waiting and higher-ranking female servants often slept in trundle beds that could be rolled under the ladies' bed during the day, a space-saving measure that also placed them literally at their mistress's feet, should she need assistance during the night. For the majority of servants, sleeping arrangements were communal and pragmatic. The great hall floor, cleared of tables after the evening meal, became a dormitory where dozens might sleep, arranged by gender and rank. Kitchen staff often chose to sleep near the kitchen fires, sacrificing fresh air for crucial warmth. Stable hands frequently slept in the stables themselves, not just to be near the horses in their care, but because the body heat of large animals made these spaces significantly warmer than many parts of the castle proper. The truly fascinating aspect of medieval sleep was its difference from modern patterns. Historical evidence suggests that medieval people typically practiced segmented sleep, going to bed shortly after sunset, sleeping for a first sleep of several hours, then waking for a period in the middle of the night before returning to a second sleep until dawn. This midnight waking period had practical applications in the battle against cold. It provided an opportunity to stoke fires, add additional coverings if needed, or even consume a small midnight meal to fuel the body's internal heat production for the second half of the night. Some medieval medical texts explicitly recommend this practice, suggesting that those who sleep straight through the night are more vulnerable to the night humours that could lead to illness, a poetic way of describing the increased risk of hypothermia during the pre-dawn hours when body temperature naturally drops. Castle life adapted seasonally in ways that went far beyond simply adding more firewood. The entire rhythm of daily activities shifted with the temperature. Summer might see castle inhabitants spread throughout the structure, utilising courtyards, wall walks and towers for various activities. Winter brought a dramatic consolidation, with life concentrated in a few somewhat warmer spaces. The Great Hall became the centre of castle life during cold months, with activities that might normally be dispersed throughout the castle, all taking place in this communal space. Administrative work, textile production, education of children, food preparation, and entertainment all migrated to wherever the largest fires burned. This concentration of bodies and activities created a feedback loop of warmth. More people generated more body heat, making the space more comfortable, which in turn attracted more activity. Have you considered how sleep itself differs in cold environments? Medieval people developed sleeping postures specifically designed for heat conservation. While modern sleepers might sprawl comfortably across a mattress, medieval castle dwellers typically slept in tightly curled positions that minimised exposed surface area. Multiple people sharing a bed would arrange themselves like spoons in a drawer, maximising contact for shared warmth. Even the timing of sleep was strategic. The warmest point in medieval castles typically came in early evening, after a day of fire tending and activity had raised temperatures to their peak. Going to bed during this relative warmth allowed sleepers to fall asleep in comparative comfort before temperatures plunged to their overnight lows in the pre-dawn hours. The coldest castles weren't necessarily those in the coldest climates. Architectural choices made enormous differences. Castles built primarily for military purposes, with defence as the overriding concern, were typically the most challenging to heat. Their thick walls, minimalist windows, and exposed positions created perfect conditions for bone-chilling interiors. Conversely, castles designed with more attention to comfort, often later medieval constructions when defence was becoming somewhat less critical, incorporated features specifically to mitigate cold. Chenonceau, in France's Loire Valley, though technically more palace than fortress, exemplifies this evolution with its relatively large windows oriented to capture southern light, interior courtyards that trapped warmth, and more numerous fireplaces. Regional variations in castle heating reflected both climate differences and cultural approaches to comfort. Scandinavian castles, despite their northern location, often incorporated sophisticated heating systems inspired by traditional Norse designs. Central hearths with heat-retaining stone constructions similar to Russian masonry stoves provided more efficient heating than the open fireplaces common in English and French castles. German and Central European castles frequently featured Kacheloven, ceramic tile stoves that operated on a principle similar to modern masonry heaters, burning fuel quickly at high temperatures and storing heat in their mass to radiate slowly for hours. These were far more efficient than open fires, but required specialised construction techniques that weren't common throughout all of Europe. Mediterranean castles in Italy and Spain sometimes incorporated Roman-inspired hypocaust systems, channels under floors or within walls that conducted heat from a central fire throughout the structure. While less common due to their construction complexity, these systems provided the most even heating available in the medieval period. Did castle dwellers simply endure the cold stoically, or did they complain as we might today? Historical records suggest both. Chronicles and personal letters from the period contain plenty of complaints about the discomfort of castle winters. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, writing from various royal castles in the 12th century, frequently mentioned the cold in her correspondence, describing one royal residence as more suitable for falcons than for a queen, due to its draughty conditions. Yet alongside these complaints ran a thread of pragmatic acceptance. Medieval people understood cold as an inevitable seasonal challenge rather than an anomaly to be eliminated. Their expectations of comfort differed fundamentally from our own, shaped by the technological limitations of their era and religious perspectives that often framed physical discomfort as an opportunity for spiritual growth. The medieval approach to winter survival in castles wasn't static, but evolved significantly over the centuries. Early medieval castles, roughly 9th to 11th centuries, relied primarily on central hearths and basic insulation techniques. By the High Middle Ages, 12th to 13th centuries, more sophisticated fireplaces, better bedding, and improved window coverings had made castle life somewhat more tolerable. The late Middle Ages, 14th to 15th centuries, saw the most significant improvements, with the wealthy increasingly converting sections of military castles into more comfortable residential spaces or building new structures with comfort as a more prominent consideration. Glass windows became more common. Interior walls were sometimes lined with wood for better insulation, and heating technology improved with the spread of tile stoves from Central Europe. What about the servants who maintained these heating systems? Their labour was constant and crucial. The role of fire tender was a specialised position in larger castle households. Individuals responsible solely for maintaining proper fires day and night. These weren't casual assignments, but critical roles that literally kept the household alive during winter months. Fire tenders needed specific knowledge about different woods and their burning properties. Oak and beech burned longest, but were harder to ignite. Pine and fir caught quickly, but burned faster and produced more smoke. A skilled fire tender would build layered fires with different woods serving different purposes: quick burning varieties to start the fire, denser hardwoods to maintain it through the night. The practical knowledge required was extensive and often regionally specific. In some areas, peat might supplement wood as a fuel source. In others, charcoal produced from summer wood harvesting would provide more consistent heat. This specialised knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, forming a crucial but often overlooked aspect of medieval survival technology. Would you be surprised to learn that medieval castle dwellers sometimes intentionally allowed certain rooms to freeze? This counterintuitive strategy served specific purposes. Food storage areas, particularly those for meat preservation, benefited from freezing temperatures. Some castle designs included north-facing chambers, specifically intended to remain cold for food preservation. Medieval freezers, essentially. Other spaces might be abandoned to the cold simply as a matter of resource prioritisation. With limited firewood and labour, difficult decisions had to be made about which spaces would be maintained at survivable temperatures and which would be effectively surrendered to winter. These decisions followed strict social hierarchies, with spaces dedicated to lower-ranking members being the first sacrificed when resources grew scarce. The psychological impact of castle winters shouldn't be underestimated. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder and winter depression gives us insight into what medieval castle dwellers might have experienced during long, dark, cold months confined to a few somewhat warmer rooms. Their solutions were communal rather than medical. Increased social activities, storytelling traditions, and winter festivals all served to combat the psychological toll of castle winters. Religious observances took on additional significance during winter months, providing structure and community at the darkest, coldest time of year. The Christmas season, which in medieval times extended from Christmas Day through Epiphany on January 6th, fell precisely when winter's grip was tightening, offering spiritual and social warmth during the physical cold. The practical realities of medieval castle life during winter created social dynamics quite different from warmer seasons. Privacy, already limited by medieval standards, became even scarcer as people concentrated in the few heated spaces. Social boundaries that might be more rigidly observed during summer became somewhat more fluid by winter necessity, with different classes sharing spaces more intimately than they otherwise might. This winter compression of castle life had significant cultural impacts. Many traditions of medieval entertainment, from chess and backgammon to storytelling and music, evolved as specifically as winter pastimes, activities that could be performed in crowded interior spaces while keeping fingers and minds nimble despite the cold. Did medieval castle dwellers simply accept winter's misery as inevitable? Not at all. They innovated constantly within the constraints of their technology. One fascinating adaptation was the use of indoor plants during winter. Certain aromatic herbs, particularly rosemary and bay laurel, would be brought inside not just for cooking, but because their scent helped mask the inevitable odours of many people confined in poorly ventilated spaces. These plants also had psychological benefits, providing living greenery during the barren winter months. Water management presented special challenges in freezing castles. Unlike modern homes where frozen pipes are a rare emergency, medieval castles dealt with frozen water as a routine winter condition. Water sources within the castle, typically wells in the courtyard or cisterns collecting rainwater, might freeze solid during cold snaps. Contingency plans included storing water in barrels indoors, melting snow or ice when necessary, and in extreme cases, rationing water for drinking while minimising its use for other purposes. Personal hygiene adapted to winter conditions as well. The popular conception that medieval people rarely bathed is largely inaccurate for castle residents, but winter did reduce bathing frequency for practical reasons. Heating sufficient water for bathing required enormous fuel expenditure, making full-body bathing a luxury reserved for the highest-ranking castle residents, even in normal times. During deep winter, even nobles might reduce full bathing, relying instead on spot cleaning of hands, face, and other essential areas. Surprisingly, some castles featured dedicated bathing rooms that functioned somewhat like primitive steam rooms. These small chambers, usually located near kitchens to take advantage of existing heat, would be filled with steam created by pouring water over heated stones. These steam baths served both hygiene and medicinal purposes, as medieval medical theory held that opening the pores through steam could release harmful humours from the body. The struggle against castle cold created unexpected innovations in furniture design. The iconic high-backed chair of medieval imagery wasn't just a status symbol. Its tall back served as a windbreak, protecting the sitter from drafts. These chairs would often be positioned with their backs to the prevailing direction of drafts, creating a protected microclimate for the occupant. Similarly, the canopy bed evolved not primarily for privacy or display, but as a practical solution to heat loss during sleep. The earliest canopy beds were simple affairs, essentially a frame supporting fabric that enclosed the sleeping space on all sides. By creating this fabric enclosure, sleepers established a microenvironment where their own body heat could raise the ambient temperature significantly compared to the open room. Would it surprise you to learn that some of the most effective medieval cold-fighting technologies came from Islamic architecture? In Spain, where Christian kingdoms gradually reconquered territories from Moorish rulers, castle designers adopted and adapted heating and cooling techniques developed in the Islamic world. The sophisticated underfloor heating systems found in some late medieval Spanish castles drew direct inspiration from similar systems in Moorish palaces like the Alhambra. This cultural exchange of comfort technologies wasn't limited to Spain. Returning crusaders brought back ideas from Byzantine and Islamic territories, including improved window designs, better insulation techniques, and even concepts for more efficient fireplaces. The medieval world, for all its political and religious divisions, experienced significant cross-cultural sharing of practical knowledge about environmental management. The battle against castle cold wasn't fought solely through technology, but also through careful timing of activities. The medieval day followed patterns dictated by temperature as much as by light. The coldest hours, in typically just before dawn, might see castle inhabitants performing activities requiring the most physical exertion, generating body heat when the environment was at its most challenging. Conversely, activities requiring fine finger dexterity, such as detailed needlework or manuscript illumination, would be reserved for the relatively warmer afternoon hours, when both natural light and temperature were at their peak. This temperature-based scheduling of activities represents a sophisticated adaptation to environmental conditions that modern climate-controlled living has largely rendered unnecessary. The experience of castle cold varied dramatically by region, creating distinct regional approaches to the challenge. Northern European castles, particularly those in Scandinavia and the Baltic regions, incorporated design elements specifically for extreme cold. Double wall construction, creating an insulating air gap between outer and inner walls, appears in some northern castles. While primarily a defensive feature, making undermining more difficult, this design had the beneficial side effect of improving insulation. Scottish castles often featured unusually thick walls, even by medieval standards, sometimes exceeding 15 feet in thickness at the base. While primarily a defensive measure, this extreme mass created a thermal buffer that moderated interior temperature swings. During brief warm periods, these massive walls would absorb heat slowly. During cold snaps, they would release it equally slowly, creating more stable, if still cold, interior environments. Mediterranean castles faced different challenges. Less extreme cold, but often more dramatic temperature swings between day and night. Their adaptations included features like interior courtyards that trapped daytime solar heat and released it slowly during evening hours, and strategic use of water features that could moderate temperature through evaporative effects. Did castle residents simply endure the same cold conditions year after year, or did they learn and adapt? Historical evidence suggests continuous improvement in cold management strategies throughout the medieval period. Castle accounts frequently show increasing expenditures for heating materials and technologies over time, suggesting that keeping warm was recognised as a worthy investment rather than an unavoidable misery. Archaeological evidence reveals that many castles underwent modifications specifically to improve winter habitability. Additional fireplaces were added to existing structures. Windows were reduced in size or filled in entirely so on north-facing walls. Interior wooden panelling was installed over stone in the most important rooms. These adaptations represent a medieval version of energy efficiency upgrades, improving comfort within the constraints of available technology. The human toll of castle cold can be glimpsed in contemporary medical texts, which devote considerable attention to conditions we now recognise as cold-related injuries. Chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels caused by repeated exposure to cold but non-freezing temperatures, were so common they were considered an inevitable part of winter life rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. More serious conditions like frostbite and hypothermia appear in medieval medical literature under various names, with treatments that range from the practical, gradual rewarming, to the bizarre application of snow to frostbitten areas, actually harmful by modern medical understanding. The frequency with which these conditions are mentioned in surviving texts suggests they were common occurrences in castle life. The elderly and very young suffered disproportionately from castle cold. Medieval chronicles and household accounts reveal higher mortality rates among these vulnerable populations during winter months. This reality shaped medieval social structures, with special provisions often made for elderly residents during winter. They might be assigned sleeping spaces closer to heat sources, or provided with additional servants specifically to tend their fires and ensure their survival through the coldest months. Children, particularly valuable noble offspring, received special cold weather accommodations. Their clothing was often more elaborate and better insulated than adult equivalents, with multiple layers and fur linings being common, even for relatively young children. Their sleeping arrangements typically placed them in the warmest available spaces, often sharing beds with nurses or caregivers for additional warmth. Would you believe that some medieval castle residents actually hibernated, in a sense? While not the true hibernation of certain animal species, some evidence suggests that medieval people practiced a form of torpor during the deepest winter months. Activity levels would decrease significantly, with more time spent sleeping or in sedentary pursuits. Metabolic rates likely decreased in response to reduced food intake, winter food stores being carefully rationed, and increased time spent in relative inactivity. This semi-hibernation state would have been an adaptive response to environmental conditions, allowing castle dwellers to conserve energy when generating heat required maximum caloric efficiency. Modern research on pre-industrial societies in extreme environments suggests that seasonal metabolic adaptations were common human responses to environmental stress before the advent of consistent artificial heating. The social stratification of medieval society was never more evident than in winter castle arrangements. While the lord and lady might be uncomfortable in their solar, they rarely faced mortal danger from the cold. Their clothing, bedding, food and access to fire all provided sufficient protection for survival, if not modern standards of comfort. For those at the bottom of the castle hierarchy, winter was a genuinely life-threatening season. Servants, particularly those whose duties kept them in unheated portions of the castle, or required them to move frequently between heated and unheated portions of the castle. Unheated areas face serious risk of cold-related injuries and death. Their clothing was typically inadequate, their sleeping arrangements minimal, and their access to supplemental heat sources limited by both resources and social convention. This disparity created a winter-specific social dynamic within castle walls. Lower-ranking residents developed communal survival strategies, sharing body heat through group sleeping arrangements, and rotating positions so that no individual would be exposed to the coldest spots for extended periods. These adaptive behaviours created winter-specific social bonds that crossed some of the rigid boundaries of medieval hierarchy, if only temporarily. The practical knowledge of cold survival represented a crucial form of medieval wisdom, passed from generation to generation through direct instruction rather than written texts. Children in castle households would learn from an early age which spots to avoid, areas where cold drafts were common, which materials provided the best insulation, wool for most purposes, fur for extreme conditions, and how to position themselves relative to heat sources for maximum benefit. This practical education extended to recognising the early signs of dangerous cold exposure. Medieval people lacked scientific understanding of hypothermia, but recognised its progression through careful observation. The drowsiness that precedes severe hypothermia was well known as a dangerous sign, with folk wisdom warning that those who fell asleep in extreme cold might never wake. Castle residents were taught to watch for these warning signs in themselves and others, intervening when necessary to prevent tragedy. Have you considered how the challenges of castle cold might have influenced medieval spirituality? The physical suffering of winter was often framed in religious terms, with cold endured as a form of penance or spiritual discipline. Monastic castles, fortified religious communities that combined defensive architecture with spaces for worship and religious life, sometimes intentionally minimised heating as part of their ascetic practices. For secular castle residents, winter's hardships were often incorporated into religious observance through prayers specifically asking for protection from cold's dangers. Saints associated with warmth or fire, particularly St. Brigid, whose feast day on February 1st falls midway through winter, and St. Blaise, February 3rd, received special veneration during winter months. The practical realities of castle cold created unexpected professional specialisations. Beyond the fire tenders already mentioned, larger castles might employ individuals specifically responsible for bed warming, draft finding, identifying and sealing sources of cold air infiltration, or managing the rotation of tapestries and wall hangings from storage to active use as seasons changed. These specialised roles created their own hierarchies and knowledge traditions. The head fire tender in a royal castle held significant responsibility. The comfort and potentially the survival of the royal family rested literally in their hands. This responsibility was reflected in relatively high status and compensation compared to other service positions of similar apparent rank. Would medieval people recognise our modern concerns about energy efficiency and insulation? Absolutely, though they would frame them differently. The conservation of heating resources was a matter of survival rather than environmental concern or cost savings. Castle accounts show careful tracking of firewood consumption, with penalties sometimes imposed on servants who used fuel wastefully. Innovative approaches to extending heating resources included strategic banking of fires, covering them with ashes to maintain embers without active flames during periods when full heat wasn't required. This technique allowed fires to be quickly revived when needed without the considerable effort of starting them from scratch, a significant efficiency in an era before convenient fire-starting tools. The battle against castle cold created unexpected alliances across social boundaries. During particularly harsh weather, the rigid separation between nobles and servants might temporarily relax out of practical necessity. Historical accounts describe occasions when extreme cold drove everyone, regardless of rank, to gather around the Great Hall fire, with social distinctions temporarily subordinated to the more pressing need for survival. These moments of environmental necessity, creating social levelling, appear frequently enough in medieval chronicles to suggest they were recognised phenomena rather than anomalies. Some scholars argue that these shared experiences of environmental hardship may have played a role in the gradual evolution of more egalitarian social structures in later periods, as they demonstrated the fundamental shared humanity underlying social distinctions. The experience of castle cold wasn't uniform throughout the medieval period, but changed significantly with broader climatic shifts. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 CE, saw generally milder European winters, making castle life somewhat less challenging during these centuries. The subsequent Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300 CE, brought significantly colder conditions, with some years seeing freezing conditions that would have been unusual in earlier centuries. These climatic shifts drove architectural and technological adaptations. Castles built during the medieval warm period often featured more windows and less concern for extreme cold protection. Those constructed or significantly renovated during the Little Ice Age typically incorporated more sophisticated heating systems and better insulation features, reflecting the harsher conditions their inhabitants faced. Did medieval castle dwellers understand the physics of heat and cold? Not in modern scientific terms, but their practical knowledge was sophisticated and effective. They understood that heat rises, that certain materials conduct cold more readily than others, and that body heat could be effectively trapped with proper insulation. Their explanatory framework might have relied on concepts like the four elements rather than molecular theory, but their practical applications worked regardless of theoretical understanding. This practical knowledge sometimes appears in medieval household management texts, which include advice on optimal placement of beds relative to heat sources, techniques for maximising heat retention in sleeping areas, and methods for determining whether a room was warm enough for safety versus comfort. The challenge of the castle cold created distinctive, regional architectural traditions that persist in surviving structures. English and Norman castles typically featured larger fireplaces built into walls, while Germanic castles more commonly incorporated tile stoves. Scandinavian designs often utilised central hearths longer than other regions, reflecting their cultural traditions and the extreme cold they faced. These regional variations weren't merely aesthetic, but represented different approaches to the same fundamental problem of survival in cold stone structures. Each tradition had advantages and disadvantages. Wall fireplaces provided visible flames, psychologically comforting, but lost much heat up the chimney. Tile stoves provided more efficient heating, but required more complex construction and maintenance. The most sophisticated heating systems appeared in castles that served as centres of secular or ecclesiastical power. The papal palace at Avignon, for instance, featured heating systems of remarkable complexity for the 14th century, including multiple interconnected fireplaces and chimney systems that distributed heat more effectively than typical castle arrangements. Royal castles often showcase the cutting edge of medieval heating technology, both for practical comfort and as demonstrations of power and sophistication. Windsor Castle's 14th century renovations under Edward III included heating systems that were among the most advanced of their time, with multiple fireplaces in the royal apartments and sophisticated arrangements of windows and doors to manage airflow and heat retention. Would you be shocked to learn that some medieval castle residents actually preferred winter to summer for certain activities? While summer offered more comfortable ambient temperatures, it also brought its own challenges. Insects, odours from inadequate sanitation, and food spoilage were all more problematic in warm weather. Some medieval texts suggest that intellectual work, particularly writing and study, was considered better suited to winter when fewer distractions and pests competed for attention. This preference appears most strongly in monastic writings, where the quiet, controlled environment of winter, when outdoor activities were limited and communal life centred around indoor spaces, was sometimes described as ideal for contemplation and scholarship. The famous medieval illuminated manuscripts, with their intricate details and gold leaf embellishments, were often winter productions, created when shorter days and confined conditions allowed for focused artistic work. The battle against castle cold created unexpected economic patterns. Regions with castles required vast quantities of firewood, creating specialised forest management practices and wood harvesting professions. The economics of heating a large castle were staggering. Some royal castles consumed the equivalent of several acres of forest each winter, requiring sophisticated supply chains and storage facilities. This demand for heating resources shaped landscapes around major castles, with forests carefully managed as renewable resources rather than simply harvested. Medieval forestry practices, while not based on modern scientific understanding, included concepts of sustainable yield and rotation that allowed continuous harvesting of firewood without depleting the resource entirely. The practical challenges of castle heating influenced diplomatic and political schedules as well. Major political gatherings, particularly those involving travel by multiple noble households, were rarely scheduled during the deepest winter months, when travel was difficult and heating large spaces for assemblies would strain resources. The medieval political calendar showed distinct seasonal patterns, with major councils and parliaments typically convening in spring or fall rather than midwinter. When winter gatherings were unavoidable, their location would be carefully selected based partly on heating capacity. Certain royal castles became preferred winter residences precisely because their design, orientation, or heating systems made them somewhat more tolerable during cold months. These practical considerations shaped political geography in ways that are often overlooked in historical analysis, focused on more dramatic factors. Did medieval castle designers consider seasonal sun patterns in their architectural plans? Evidence suggests they did, at least by the later medieval period. Analysis of castle orientations shows that many were positioned to maximise southern exposure for main residential buildings while using the natural shelter of hillsides or artificial structures to block prevailing winter winds. Window placements in later medieval castles often show sophisticated understanding of solar gain principles. Southern-facing windows would be larger and more numerous, allowing winter sunlight to warm interior spaces, while northern exposures featured minimal openings to reduce heat loss. This solar-conscious design appears most clearly in castles built or significantly renovated during the Little Ice Age, when climate pressures made such considerations more critical. The experience of extreme cold in medieval castles created distinctive cultural expressions. Winter tales, stories specifically told during the coldest months, often featured themes of endurance, transformation, and the supernatural. Many folklore traditions associated with winter originated in the shared experience of castle communities gathered around fires during long, cold evenings. These cultural adaptations served practical psychological purposes, providing distraction from physical discomfort while reinforcing community bonds through shared experience. The tradition of winter storytelling created a rich oral literature that would eventually influence written works as literacy expanded in the later medieval period. The most vulnerable castle residents developed their own survival strategies, sometimes at odds with official rules or expectations. Archaeological evidence from servant quarters and lower status areas of castles reveals improvised heating arrangements, small unauthorised fires, heat-reflecting arrangements of available materials, and other creative adaptations that might not appear in official castle records, but left physical traces for modern archaeologists to discover. These unofficial adaptations represent a form of resistance to the unequal distribution of heating resources within castle hierarchies. While rarely documented in contemporary texts, which typically reflected the perspective of those in power, they appear consistently in the archaeological record, suggesting widespread informal strategies for survival among those with least access to official heating resources. Would you believe that some castle residents actually engineered their living spaces for better heat retention without modern tools or materials? Archaeological investigations reveal sophisticated modifications to standard castle architecture made by inhabitants seeking better protection from cold. These include adding internal wooden walls to create air gaps for insulation, constructing secondary ceilings below stone vaults to reduce the heated volume, and creating angled reflective surfaces near fireplaces to direct more heat into living spaces. These modifications, often made incrementally over generations, transform the thermal properties of castle interiors without changing their external defensive characteristics. They represent a form of vernacular engineering, practical solutions developed through experience rather than formal design, that significantly improved survival conditions within the constraints of medieval technology. The battle against castle cold wasn't fought solely through physical means, but also through psychological adaptation. Medieval texts reveal sophisticated understanding of what we would now call the psychology of cold perception, the recognition that perceived temperature depends partly on expectations, distractions, and mental state. Winter entertainments weren't just pastimes, but deliberate strategies for managing cold perception. Music, games, and storytelling served to focus attention away from physical discomfort. Communal activities generated both physical warmth through shared body heat and psychological warmth through social connection. These non-technological approaches to cold management were as important to survival as physical heating methods. The experience of castle cold wasn't static throughout the year, but followed seasonal progressions that shaped castle life rhythms. Fall was a time of preparation, gathering and processing heating materials, bringing out winter textiles from storage, and gradually transitioning living patterns from outdoor to indoor focus. Deep winter, typically January and February in most of Europe, represented the period of maximum concentration, with castle life compressed into the fewest heated spaces and social activities designed specifically for crowded indoor conditions. The late winter period brought its own challenges: dwindling fuel supplies, increasing psychological strain from confinement, and the physical effects of months of suboptimal conditions. Spring brought gradual expansion of living space as temperatures moderated, though with careful attention to unpredictable cold snaps that might necessitate rapid retreat to winter arrangements. This seasonal expansion and contraction of usable castle space created distinctive annual rhythms that shaped everything from social interactions to work schedules. Did medieval castle dwellers track temperature? Not with thermometers, which weren't invented until the late 16th century, but through careful observation of environmental indicators. Ice formation patterns, the behaviour of animals, and physical sensations were all used to gauge relative cold and make appropriate adjustments to heating and clothing. Some castle records include surprisingly detailed observations about comparative cold across years or seasons. References to wine freezing in cellars, water freezing in indoor basins, or ink freezing in writing rooms all provided reference points for relative temperature that allowed castle managers to make decisions about resource allocation and activity scheduling. The battle against castle cold created unexpected professional opportunities for women within the otherwise male-dominated world of castle management. Responsibilities for textile care, including the crucial winter tapestries and bedding that could mean the difference between life and death, typically fell to female household members or servants. Senior female servants often held significant authority over winter preparations, directing the complex logistics of bringing appropriate textiles out of storage, ensuring they were properly cleaned and repaired, and overseeing their strategic deployment throughout the castle. This responsibility gave these women considerable practical power within the household structure, as their knowledge directly impacted survival chances for all residents. The practical knowledge of cold management wasn't evenly distributed across medieval society, but concentrated in castle communities where stone construction created the greatest challenges. This specialised knowledge became part of the cultural capital of castle residents, with techniques and adaptations passed between castle households through marriage alliances, servant transfers, and deliberate information sharing. Surviving household manuals and letters between castle residents sometimes include detailed discussions of cold management techniques, suggesting that this practical knowledge was valued and deliberately exchanged. Innovations in heating, insulation, or cold weather clothing might spread between castles through these networks of shared information, creating regional traditions of cold adaptation. Would you be surprised to learn that some aspects of medieval cold management were more effective than their modern equivalents? The heavy wool clothing favoured for winter castle wear provided better insulation when damp than many modern synthetic materials. The layering techniques developed through centuries of practical experience created remarkably effective insulation systems without modern technology. Similarly, The bed curtain systems used in medieval castles created micro-environments that required no external energy input, yet could raise the effective temperature around sleepers by 10 degrees or more compared to the open room. These passive heating solutions worked with available materials and technologies to create surprisingly effective results. The experience of castle cold wasn't uniform across Europe, but varied significantly with geography, climate, and cultural traditions. Eastern European castles, facing continental climate extremes, developed different solutions than their Western European counterparts. The castles of the Teutonic Knights in what is now Poland and the Baltic states incorporated massive hypocauste systems, heating channels running under floors and sometimes within walls, inspired by Roman designs but adapted for the extreme cold of northeastern Europe. Mediterranean castles in regions with milder but still challenging winters developed their own distinctive adaptations. Spanish castles, particularly those influenced by Moorish design traditions, sometimes featured sophisticated passive solar heating arrangements, with stone or tile floors positioned to absorb winter sunlight and radiate heat back into rooms during evening hours. The battle against castle cold influenced medieval medicine in significant ways. Medical texts devoted considerable attention to cold-related conditions, from minor ailments like chilblains to life-threatening hypothermia. Preventative measures were emphasised, with detailed recommendations for clothing, activity levels, and diet believed to increase resistance to cold. Medieval physicians recognised the particular vulnerability of certain populations to cold-related illness. The elderly, very young, and those weakened by other conditions received special attention in medical literature related to winter survival. Recommendations for their care included specific dietary supplements, additional clothing layers, and preferred positioning relative to heat sources. Did medieval castle residents understand concepts like insulation and thermal mass? Their terminology differed from modern scientific language, but their practical applications demonstrate sophisticated understanding of these principles. The strategic use of tapestries on walls, rushes on floors, and bed curtains all show intuitive grasp of insulation concepts. Similarly, the practice of using heated stones or bricks as thermal mass to warm beds demonstrates understanding of heat storage and transfer principles. These practical applications didn't require a theoretical framework to be effective. They were developed through observation and experience, refined over generations into sophisticated systems for environmental management within technological constraints. The most extreme cold adaptation appeared in castle communities at the geographic margins of medieval Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, the Baltic regions, and higher elevation areas of Central Europe. These regions combined castle architecture, primarily for defence, with indigenous cold weather survival techniques developed over centuries of adaptation to extreme environments. In Scandinavian castles, for instance, sleeping platforms might be constructed above and around massive central hearths using stone or brick structures that would absorb heat during the day and radiate it throughout the night. These designs, adapted from traditional Norse longhouse architecture, proved more effective for extreme cold than the separate bed and fireplace arrangements common in more temperate regions. The practical challenges of castle heating influenced religious practices in unexpected ways. The medieval church calendar included numerous fast days when consumption of animal products was prohibited. These restrictions posed special challenges during winter, when the high-calorie animal fats that helped fuel internal heat production were most necessary for survival. Religious authorities recognised this practical reality, and dispensations from fasting requirements were more readily granted in colder regions or during particularly harsh winters. This flexibility represents a pragmatic adaptation of religious practice to environmental realities, spiritual requirements moderated by recognition of physical necessities. Would you believe that some castle residents actually preferred sleeping in certain types of cold? Historical accounts suggest that many medieval people distinguished between dry cold and damp cold, considering the former far more tolerable. Sleeping chambers were sometimes located in towers or upper floors, specifically because these spaces, while potentially colder in absolute temperature, tended to be drier than ground floor rooms where rising damp from soil could create bone-chilling humidity. This preference reflects practical experience with how different types of cold affect the human body. Modern science confirms that a humid cold feels colder than dry cold at the same temperature because moisture on the skin conducts heat away from the body more efficiently than dry air. Medieval castle dwellers lacked this scientific explanation, but recognised the phenomenon through direct experience. The battle against castle cold created distinctive sleep patterns that differed significantly from modern norms. Beyond the segmented sleep already mentioned, castle residents practiced what might be called strategic sleeping, timing sleep periods to align with optimal heating conditions rather than consistent daily schedules. During the coldest periods, sleep might be opportunistic rather than scheduled, with castle residents napping when conditions allowed rather than maintaining strict night/day divisions. This adaptation maximised the benefit of temporarily favourable conditions while minimising exposure during the most dangerous periods, typically the pre-dawn hours when both fires and body temperature naturally reach their lowest points. The experience of extreme cold in castles created lasting linguistic and cultural expressions that survive in modern European languages. Many idioms and sayings related to cold, warmth and survival originated in the practical realities of castle life. The English expression cold comfort, for instance, likely derives from the minimal heating available to lower status castle residents, technically present but inadequate for true comfort. Similarly, many European languages contain expressions related to bed warming that originated in castle practices. The French expression chaufferette de lit originally referred specifically to the warming pans used to prepare noble beds, but evolved to describe any source of comforting warmth in challenging circumstances. Did medieval castle residents track and predict weather to prepare for cold snaps? Without modern meteorology, they relied on careful observation of natural indicators and accumulated folk wisdom. Castle records sometimes include detailed weather observations, suggesting systematic attention to patterns that might help predict coming conditions. Animal behaviour served as an important predictive tool. Unusual thickness of animal fur, early migration patterns of birds, or behavioural changes in livestock were all interpreted as indicators of coming winter severity. These observations, while not always reliable by modern scientific standards, provided useful probabilistic guidance for winter preparations. The battle against castle cold influenced medieval literature in ways that continue to shape our cultural imagination. The motif of the warm hearth as sanctuary appears repeatedly in medieval texts, reflecting the literal life-saving role of fire in castle environments. The contrast between exterior cold and interior warmth became a powerful metaphor in religious and secular writing alike. Winter imagery in medieval poetry often draws directly from the experience of castle life during cold months. Descriptions of frost patterns on windows, the sound of wind through stone corridors, or the precious quality of winter sunlight reflect the heightened awareness of environmental details that came from living in spaces where these factors directly impacted survival. The practical realities of the castle, cold created distinctive sensory experiences that shaped medieval aesthetics. The visual culture of the period shows remarkable attention to qualities of light, particularly the slanting winter sunlight that provided both illumination and precious warming. Manuscript illuminations often depict interior scenes with careful attention to light sources and their effects, reflecting the crucial importance of light and heat in daily experience. Similarly, the olfactory environment of winter castles, dominated by wood smoke, wool, and the distinctive scents of many bodies in confined spaces, influenced everything from religious incense preferences to the development of perfumery. The positive associations of certain scents particularly those related to warmth and comfort, can be traced directly to their role in the sensory landscape of winter castle life. Would you be surprised to learn that some castle residents actually engineered microclimates within their living spaces? Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated arrangements of furniture, textiles, and portable screens used to create protected zones within larger rooms. These impromptu structures, essentially rooms within rooms, could be warmed more efficiently than entire chambers, and moved as needed to follow available heat sources. This adaptive approach to interior space represents a sophisticated response to environmental challenges within technological constraints. Rather than attempting to heat entire volumes to comfortable levels, an impossible task with available resources, castle residents created nested environments of decreasing size and increasing warmth, from the castle as a whole to specific rooms to micro-environments within those rooms. The battle against castle cold created unexpected social opportunities, particularly for women. The necessity of indoor confinement during winter months provided occasions for female-centred activities that might be more limited during warmer seasons, when gender segregation in outdoor activities was more pronounced. Winter textile work, spinning, weaving, embroidery, and garment construction typically took place in communal settings, where women of different social ranks might work together by necessity, creating opportunities for knowledge exchange and social connection across usual boundaries. These winter work gatherings served both practical and social functions, producing essential materials while creating community bonds that helped sustain morale during challenging conditions. The experience of castle cold wasn't static throughout medieval history, but evolved with broader technological and social developments. Early medieval castles, roughly 9th to 11th centuries, relied primarily on central hearths, body heat concentration, and basic insulation techniques. By the High Middle Ages, 12th to 13th centuries, wall fireplaces, better bedding, and improved window coverings had made castle life somewhat more tolerable. The late Middle Ages, 14th to 15th centuries, saw the most significant improvements, with the wealthy increasingly converting sections of military castles into more comfortable residential spaces or building new structures with comfort as a more prominent consideration. Glass windows became more common. Interior walls were sometimes lined with wood for better insulation, and heating technology improved with the spread of tile stoves from Central Europe. Did medieval castle dwellers understand the health impacts of chronic cold exposure? Their explanatory framework differed from modern medicine, but their observations were often accurate. Medieval medical texts associate prolonged cold exposure with joint ailments, likely what we now recognise as arthritis exacerbated by cold, respiratory conditions, and increased vulnerability to contagious disease, all connections supported by modern research. These medical understandings shaped castle life in practical ways. Elderly residents, recognised as particularly vulnerable to cold's effects, received special accommodations during winter months. Preventative measures, including specific dietary recommendations and clothing requirements, were implemented based on these understandings of cold's health impacts. If you've enjoyed this chilling journey through medieval castle life, remember that history is full of fascinating stories of human ingenuity and survival. The men and women who endured freezing castle nights centuries ago developed solutions that shaped architecture, technology, and culture in ways that continue to influence our world today. Their experiences remind us that comfort is a relatively recent luxury, and that human adaptability has always been our greatest survival tool. From the lord in his curtained bed to the servant huddled by kitchen embers, medieval castle dwellers faced environmental challenges that would overwhelm most modern people, and they survived through creativity, community, and sheer determination. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into the fascinating, forgotten realities of history. Whether it's the freezing nights of medieval castles or the scorching challenges of desert caravans, there's always another story of human resilience waiting to be told. Leave a comment below sharing which aspect of medieval castle life surprised you most. Was it the bed warmers, the strategic hibernation, or perhaps the sophisticated layering techniques? Your engagement helps shape future explorations into history's most compelling secrets.